Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, coming to you from the Overflow Room in our series, Abstract Sounds, Concrete Images or Objects, or I never remember what we call this series. It doesn't matter. The point of it is that we're talking about music which has absolutely no indication of what it is, but it is. It's something. It creates an image in your mind, and that image is so vivid and so concrete and so illustratively detailed that you think, oh, the composer had to have something in mind, but he doesn't tell us what it is, which gives us the opportunity to tell him what we think it is, which I think is actually even more interesting because any sensible composer wants to know what his audience thinks of what he did. And I sort of advertised or telegraphed that I wanted to talk about this particular piece in advance in my talk on imprinting, on your first experience of certain pieces, because this is the trio of the Minuet of Haydn's Symphony number 88, which is just one of my favorite works in the whole universe, and it was one of the first pieces of classical music that I heard, and that just blew me away. And this is the part that blew me away. And because the symphony had this little bit that blew me away, I gradually came to understand or enjoy the entire work. Initially, and this so often happens, I think, to all of us, we hear just a bit of something. And that bit of something is incredibly compelling, and the rest of it is less so, which is perfectly normal. And eventually, we come around to understanding the piece whole. It's very, very interesting, I think, to note. If you read criticism, I'm sort of a student of criticism, being a critic. I think that's sort of a professional obligation, but I also think it's fascinating. If you read criticism of past masters, particularly in the 19th century when music criticism really got going, you realize that people really had very little conception of the totality of a piece of music, of how all of its parts interrelated, because they never had a chance to hear it. This is particularly true of orchestral works. I'm not so much talking about chamber music or piano pieces where you had a score and most people, who were going to be listening to it knew how to play an instrument and could try it out themselves. But when it came to large orchestral works, there were no recordings. You might hear it once or twice in your lifetime, and you had to go by what you heard. And so when you read these contemporary reviews of things like, Brahms symphonies or Dvorak symphonies, you find the critics saying things like, well, the first movement has a second theme that's very beautiful, but the working out isn't very interesting, and this section isn't too great, but this movement was really pretty. They don't have a conception of the complete work because they're only experiencing and commenting on the bits that struck them at a first hearing. And that's all they had. I think it's a perfectly normal thing. Today, because of recordings, because of the ubiquity of all of this stuff, you see time and time again, and I'm one of them, I freely admit, these people saying, well, you have to be able to grasp a work whole. You have to perceive the entire large-scale form. And music critics and academics particularly write about these pieces in terms of large-scale structures and superstructures, and they analyze these things to death. And they do it because they can. And, they ask us to listen to works whole because we can. But that isn't how it started. And that isn't how most people experience music, even today, because they're not going to listen to it again unless they have a recording and they feel like playing it 50 or 60 times to really, really get to know the piece. So for most of us, especially when it's a first encounter, we're stuck on picking out the bits that really grab you. And this trio, the trio of this minuet, is a grabber. If ever there was one, actually Haydn's 88th Symphony is full of grabbers. The slow movement is stunning. It has one of the most beautiful tunes anybody ever wrote. Brahms said, I want my 10th symphony to sound like this. What that meant about symphonies numbers 5 through 9, I have no idea. But that's what Brahms said. And it really is an extraordinary piece. But the trio of this minuet speaks to me. And I'm going to play you two versions of it, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit, and I'll tell you how it speaks to me. So let us listen first to the Heidelberg Symphoniker the Heidelberg Symphony under Thomas Fye on the Haenssler label in the trio of the Minuet of Haydn's Symphony number 88. God, I love that. Isn't that just the most evocative thing you've ever heard? And now let's listen to a competing version that's equally fine with Sándor Vég. This is a live recording from the Salzburg Festival on Orfeo, recorded in 92-93 with the Camerata Academica on Orfeo. Same piece. They are a bit different, aren't they? And there's a reason for that. There's one reason that I find this piece so absolutely amazing. The actual, well, in order to explain it, let me first of all tell you what it sounds like to me. It's a country scene. It's a country scene with bagpipes. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. I don't see specific things happening. I see it as a portrait, a picture. You know, like Bruegel's The Harvest, you know, one of those things with peasants out in the fields or something like that. But there's a bagpipe going around and it's lazy and lovely. And it's the obvious inspiration, I think, to the Scene by the Brook, the second movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It is a pastoral subject or object, if you want to call it that. And much beyond that, we don't really know. Sometimes when I hear it, I see it as almost, you know, there's a bagpiper in front of one of those old castles with ivy-covered walls, something like that. But it's a portrait. It's a painting, and painting in tones. And it is extraordinary music, isn't it? But one of the things that really turned me on to classical music generally is that I heard several performances of this, and they all sounded a little bit different. And there's something truly remarkable about this piece, this tiny little trio that I want to show you. So I have the score here. Take a look at the score. I put it up here. If you look at the score, you see that most of the parts are marked piano, but not all of them. The two bassoons are marked forte assai, very loud, and then the horns are marked forte, loud, while everyone else is marked piano. That, my friends, is a revolution in music. Because before Haydn came along, generally speaking, there was what we called a general dynamic. Now, General Dynamics was not, a company that made, technology things or whatever that company is. General Dynamics means that a composer would simply write loud or soft, and that would apply to everybody. And everyone would just play loud or soft as a group. And it was the composer's job to use or add or subtract instruments and sort of balance the texture and sonority. But with Haydn abandoned General Dynamics for this particular trio, and each part, as you can see, has its own dynamics, and they're very, very different. There's a difference between piano and very loud and just plain loud, and that was new. That was something very, very new in music. Haydn did it for the purpose of painting, and that was still, I remember very vividly once rehearsing Mahler's First, and the trio of the Scherzo, which has some weird effects with col legno bowing and all kinds of things going on. Mahler was famous for giving each part its own dynamic. And you cannot trust, if you're a performer in the orchestra, what the other guys are doing to figure out how loud you should be doing it, because your part may be soft while someone else's may be loud. All of that's still a little bit unusual, not in contemporary music, but it was unusual even for the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Most composers use general dynamics. Honegger is fascinating. Honegger, if you look at his scores, writes dynamique générale for his scores. He just says, this is the general dynamic, and lets it go. He doesn't specify different dynamics, most of the time anyway, for the individual parts. But here Haydn does. And that was an entirely new thing in music. And it's something that could not be done without actually explaining to the players what you wanted, because you have to say, bassoons, you are louder than the strings. Horns, that is a forte. Players do not like to be exposed. They really don't, especially when they don't think they ought to be. And it's nerve-wracking because all of a sudden you're popping out with your own little thing, and then you're back into the general texture. And this trio does that. And even now, one of the things that just fascinated me about it was that every performance is different. You would think it's really rather simple. When you look at that score, it's not all that complicated, not that many instruments involved, right? But it really can be played so many different ways. There are actually some alternate textural things too. Some of them have like a little timpani part in them and whatnot, but that's a scholarly text problem. But it really has the opportunity to be interpreted in many, many different perspectives because of the way those different dynamics are going to get balanced, and just how loudly those bassoons are supposed to play, and whether or not the horns are really going to play forte, and whether or not the bass part, you'll notice that the basses in that score have, they're on the beat with everything, going on. And when the music suddenly becomes forte, and Haydn doesn't indicate a dynamic, should they be forte too? It's the beginning, first of all, of really modern music, of the way modern music is written and modern music is played, and the kind of music that's romantic, that requires that the interpreters bring something of themselves to the music to sort out what the composer's intentions are going to be. And because of that, this picture that Haydn drew, this marvelous, marvelous picture, sounds different in every single performance. And that's one of the things that gives the music its repeatability, the desire to want to hear it again. You love that moment. You want to hear that moment. You want to see how everyone does that moment. And you're going to like more, some more than others. It's an extraordinary musical event, this little trio, historically, just for purely musical reasons, but also in its amazing ability to create the picture, that ivy-covered castle with the bagpiper in front of it. Oh my goodness, I just think this is one of the most fabulous things I ever heard. And what made it so amazing was that I was very young when I heard it, but I heard it. I saw it in my head. I saw the picture. I knew what it was. And what that told me was that abstract music could communicate things. It speaks to us, and it speaks to us with amazing specificity. So please, folks, Tell me what the specifics are. What does that little bit say to you? I'm very, very curious to know. So thank you for joining me, friends. Keep on listening. Make America classical again. Take care.